Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at one of those big philosophical questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything at all exist? Now, before we begin, it's worth just clarifying the scope of this question. We are concerned specifically with concrete objects, spatio-temporal objects, things which exist in the physical universe. Maybe you think that there are abstract objects, like numbers, lines, sets, mathematical objects like that, and so on. These objects, if they exist at all, presumably exist necessarily. 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it could not possibly have been otherwise. So we're not really going to be interested in explaining the existence of abstract objects, again, if they exist. We're just going to be focusing on the concrete spatio-temporal objects. So with that said, let's look at how philosophers have dealt with this question. Nicholas Rescher, in his article on explaining existence, distinguishes several possible answers to the question. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll focus on the ones that have been, I think, the most popular. So first of all, there is what Rescher calls rejectionism. According to rejectionism, the question is somehow illegitimate or meaningless. When you think about the question, there is something rather strange about it. We are asking for an explanation of why there is something, right? Why something exists. Now, in general, when we give an explanation, we explain one thing in terms of something else. There is the explanandum, which is the thing to be explained, and then there is the explanans, the thing that does the explaining. But any factor that is proposed to explain why there is something will itself be something. Hence, it will be part of the thing that we want to explain. So if we say there is something because of X, right? There is something rather than nothing because of X. Well, it seems like X is going to be something, and so any explanation utilizing X can't explain all of something. That's what we're trying to do here. We're being asked to explain all of something. Why does anything at all exist? So the problem with the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is that it's a request for explanation which rules out the possibility of introducing any explanans. It rules out the possibility of anything that we can cite as an explanation. So the question is illegitimate. It requests a logical impossibility. It rules out the very kind of answer that it requests that we give. So that's, I guess, the standard way of defending a rejectionist position. The problem with this justification of rejectionism is that it assumes that explanations have to cite causes. Now, obviously, there are many contexts in which we give causal explanations. We explain the explosion by citing the fact that there was gas in the room and that somebody struck a match. We explain the lung cancer by citing the smoking, and so on. But not all explanations need to be causal explanations. The reason for the existence of something, or the reason for some fact obtaining, need not consist in the operation of other existing things. So an explanation only needs to cite facts. It doesn't necessarily need to cite other things that stand in the relation of cause and effect. So here's a simple example that's often given in the literature. Suppose that Frank has 23 strawberries and he wants to distribute these strawberries evenly between his 2 children without cutting any of the strawberries. But he finds he can't do this. Why not? Why can't he do it? Well, because 23 cannot be divided by 2 into whole numbers. This is an explanation, but it's not a causal explanation. We're not citing some prior state that causally brought about the explanandum, right? What we're trying to explain here is Frank's inability to divide 23 strawberries evenly between his 2 children, right? And so when we say 23 cannot be divided by 2, we're not citing some state that causally brought about that thing we're looking to explain. Instead, we are explaining by citing mathematical constraints. So here's an explanation, but it's not a causal explanation. This is an explanation by mathematical constraint or something like that. Another type of explanation, which may be more pertinent in the present context, is noted by Robert Nozick in his book Philosophical Explanations. This is explanatory self-subsumption. So essentially, Nozick says, there are some facts that explain themselves. How does this work? Well, many explanations involve subsumption under a law. We explain why the planets orbit as they do by citing the laws of Newtonian mechanics. So you have the phenomenon, and then you sort of subsume that phenomenon under a law. So we cite the orbits of the planets we explain the orbits of the planets by citing the laws of Newtonian mechanics. Furthermore, these laws can themselves be explained by citing the laws of general relativity, because the laws of Newtonian mechanics are, in a wide range of conditions, approximated in general relativity, which we take to be the correct account. So, given that we take general relativity to be correct, right? If we can assume that that's correct, then we can explain the holding of at least something approximating the Newtonian laws. Now, suppose we ask of our fundamental laws, whatever they may be, why they hold true. To explain this, we cite some principle P, right? So P gives a sufficient condition for a law being true. And it says something like, any law-like statement having characteristic C is true. So we explain the fundamental laws by subsuming them under P by showing that they have characteristic C. Obviously, I'm talking in very abstract terms here because, we don't yet know what the fundamental laws are, and we certainly haven't yet explained the fundamental laws by citing some underlying principle P, right? So this has to be stated in fairly abstract terms, but hopefully you can see the idea. We can cite some further underlying law to explain why some fundamental law is true, and that might be something like principle P, which says any law-like statement having characteristic C is true, and then we would explain the laws by showing that they have characteristic C. Okay, so far so good, but that still leaves the question of, well, why is P true? And the trick here, Nozick says, is that a law can be subsumed under itself, because P may also have characteristic C, and that would yield this explanation. So there's P, any law-like statement with characteristic C is true, and then P is a law-like statement with characteristic C, P is true. This is explanatory self-subsumption. P is a fact that explains itself. Now, it's very important to note that this is not an argument for the truth of P. This is not an argument, this is not trying to give you a reason for believing that P. Instead, it's an explanation of P's truth. So if you grant that P is true, if you grant that any law-like statement having characteristic C is true, then it seems you can explain the truth of this by showing that it also has characteristic C. But obviously, in order for us to accept that P is true, we would need independent reasons. So we can contrast this with another explanation. So S, every sentence with exactly 8 words is true. S is a sentence with exactly 8 words. S is true. Okay, obviously S is false. And this little argument here provides no reason whatsoever for thinking that it's true. But if S were true, right, that would be an explanation for its truth. So yeah, it's important to distinguish an argument for the truth of P from an explanation of P. Nozick is only claiming that we can, in principle, give a self-subsuming explanation of P. Establishing the truth of P is another matter. But this could perhaps give you a sense of what a non-causal explanation might look like. And we'll come back to this point later. So anyway, the key thing to see for now is that not all explanations need to be causal explanations. And the question, why is there something rather than nothing, merely asks for an explanation. It doesn't ask for a causal explanation. Actually, this point is fairly obvious when you consider that, in principle, the universe might be eternal. So maybe for any state X, we can cite some prior state that is the cause of X. So we have an infinite series of states extending back into the past. That's a possible state of affairs. if that state of affairs holds, it would allow us to give a causal explanation, at least in principle, for everything there is. Every single thing, you could cite some prior state that caused it. But obviously that wouldn't answer our question, why is there something rather than nothing? Because we would still be able to ask, well, okay, why does that whole series of causes exist rather than no series at all? Obviously we're not looking for a causal explanation here. Okay, none of this shows that there actually is a non-causal explanation available for our question. Might there be some other reason for thinking that the question is illegitimate? Well, one obvious problem with rejectionism is that the question does actually seem to make sense. I mean, certainly we can imagine that nothing existing, right? We can imagine that things were such that nothing came into existence. So that the question doesn't seem to rest on a false presupposition. After all, it's true that there is in fact something, not nothing, right? So when we ask why is there something rather than nothing, that's not like asking why does Mercury have 2 moons? Because in that case Mercury doesn't have any moons at all, right? So there's just a kind of false presupposition in that question. There doesn't appear to be a false presupposition in our question, why is there something rather than nothing? Also consider that we can, again, in principle, it looks like we can explain various properties of the universe as a whole. Its structure, its volume, its mass, the laws that govern the interaction of its parts, and so on. So why would there be anything untoward in trying to explain its existence? Again, it's not just obvious that there would be anything illegitimate or meaningless about the question. Okay, the second option discussed by Rescher is what he calls mystificationism. According to the mystificationists, the question is perfectly legitimate, but it's unanswerable. It is and will forever remain a mystery. This is the kind of option that might be favoured by someone like Colin McGinn. Colin McGinn argues that what makes a number of philosophical problems, such as the mind-body problem, so intractable is simply that they are beyond human cognitive powers to solve. There are some things that human brains just can't do, in the same way that it would be beyond the cognitive powers of a dog to understand quantum mechanics, so it is beyond our cognitive powers to solve certain problems that are perennial in philosophy. In fact, specifically, McGinn argues that human minds work best at solving problems when we're able to apply reductionist methodology, where we identify certain primitive elements and primitive relations in a domain, and then we see how to combine those primitive elements and relations to give rise to the more complex structures in the domain. So basically we break things down into their constituent parts and show how the overall system arises from the interaction of these parts. That kind of reductionist methodology is standard in the sciences. It allows us to uncover causal mechanisms that produce things. So if you want to understand the circulatory system, you break it down into the heart and lungs and veins, and you see how each one functions and how they all fit together. The thought is humans are very, very good at that kind of reasoning. And when we ask how particular things are brought into existence, that kind of methodology can be applied. I can explain in this sort of reductionist term, I can explain the mechanisms which brought my computer into existence, or the mechanisms which brought me into existence. Obviously, our question is not amenable to this kind of methodology. It's a perfectly legitimate question. It does have a solution in principle. We're just not equipped to find it, because the kind of things that we are good at, the kind of problems that we are good at solving, well, this just isn't a problem anything like those. And I mean, whether we take McGinn's line, obviously there are plenty of other reasons why we might think that this problem is just beyond our power to solve. I mean, we're talking about, like, look, we exist in the universe. We have fairly limited cognitive powers. We've discovered some things about the universe, but to ask why stuff exists rather than nothing, I mean, that's taking us way outside of our, of the normal sort of things that we think about, and the normal sort of things that we're equipped, the normal sort of problems that we're equipped to deal with. So, there's a fairly, I think, powerful, intuitive pull towards the mystificationist answer. Now, as Rescher says, though, while mystificationism may be correct, it looks like it's going to be an option of last resort. So as a general methodological principle, Rescher says that we should do what we can to find sensible explanations of phenomena, provided there's still some hope of achieving an explanation. And so, I mean, and that makes sense, right? Like, we are curious creatures. We want to know how the world works. We want to explain the world. So, naturally we search out explanations, and we do what we can to develop them, and we give it our best shot. So the question is going to be, are we at that point of last resort? I mean, on the one hand, this question has been around for many millennia, and so far it seems that nobody has come up with a good answer, or at least nobody has come up with an answer that has achieved a widespread consensus, so that might make us pessimistic about ever answering it. On the other hand, new developments are still being made. We don't seem to have exhausted all of the conceptual possibilities. Assuming then that we acknowledge that the question is legitimate, and assuming that we acknowledge that there are answers, conceptual possibilities that we haven't yet considered, well, we shouldn't just give up. I mean, perhaps an explanation will forever be beyond our grasp, but Rescher says we shouldn't give up yet. It's also worth noting that any argument for mystificationism, such as McGinn's argument, so the argument that human minds are best at solving problems that apply the reductionist methodology, and this just isn't a question to which that methodology will be applicable. Those kinds of arguments, any argument like that for mystificationism, is going to itself depend on controversial claims. And if the reason for favouring mystificationism is philosophically controversial, then actually there's hope that that reason is wrong, and so hope that mystificationism is wrong, and the question might one day be answered. So, I mean, even if you find mystificationism plausible, it looks like there might be good reason for considering at least other answers to this question. Okay, a third option then is the brute fact view. On this view, it's just a brute fact that something exists. There's no reason why there is something rather than nothing. The world just exists. Either it has always been here, or it just popped into existence, and that's that. There is nothing more to be said. So it's a brute fact. Of course, the question is, why should we think this is true? Well, one popular defence of the brute fact view was given by Bertrand Russell in a famous debate with Copleston. The basic idea is that we can explain particular things, but it's a category mistake to ask for an explanation of everything. Russell draws the analogy that while it's true that every man who exists has a mother, it would obviously be fallacious to infer that the human race as a whole has a mother. So similarly then, while we might expect to be able to give explanations for every particular thing that exists, we shouldn't expect that there is an explanation for existent things as a whole taken as a collective, right? We shouldn't expect that we can give an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. Like, I can give an explanation for why there is this cup on my desk rather than nothing on my desk. That's fine. I can cite the things that brought the cup into existence. But it doesn't make any sense, or at least it's fallacious to step from that to asking, well, why in general is there something? Why is there stuff rather than no stuff, period? That's not a legitimate step. Why is there stuff? Well, there just is. That's it. Now, Rescher thinks that Russell's argument here fails. So according to Rescher, what Russell has shown is the following. The fact that every member of some class C, say humans, has an explanation of type X, say parents, that does not entail that the totality of class C, that C as a whole, has an explanation of that particular type. Indeed, it may be absurd to look for an explanation of that particular type. So, yes, right, every member of the class humans has an explanation, like you can explain their existence by appealing to parents. It would be absurd to ask for the parents of the human race. But it just does not follow from this that we should not look for any kind of explanation for C as a whole, because C as a whole may have some other kind of explanation. And after all, this is what we do in the case of humans, right? We do, in fact, want an explanation for how the human species arose, and modern science has furnished us with an explanation. Knowing that all children are born from parents does not show that the Darwinian explanation for the origin of the human species is misguided. So, at best, all Russell has shown is that it may be misguided to search for explanations of a particular sort when asking the question of why anything exists. But we already knew this. As we've already discussed, we can't answer this question by citing causes. So we're not looking for causal explanations, for example. It is just worth noting in Russell's defence here that the context in which he gave his argument was a debate about the existence of God. Now, in that particular context, his argument might have been reasonable, because perhaps citing God as an explanation for why anything exists is to give an explanation of the wrong sort. That would be so perhaps that would be like explaining the existence of the human race by saying it was born from two parents. And this is plausible, because by appealing to God, we seem to be giving a causal explanation. We seem to be saying God caused the universe to exist. But obviously, if we want to explain why there's something rather than nothing, well, God is something, right? God counts as part of the something, so we need to explain the existence of God as well. Anyway, that's just saying something there in defence of Russell in the specific context in which he gave that argument. But it doesn't seem that Russell's argument provides a particularly plausible case for the brute fact view in general. So here's another argument for the brute fact view. We might turn this question around and say, well, why shouldn't there have been something, right? I mean, the question is, why is there something rather than nothing, right? But it's sort of tempted to turn it around and just say, well, why not, right? Why shouldn't there have been something? Why shouldn't something have just popped into existence or have existed forever? After all, it's not as though there would have been something to prevent something from popping into existence or from existing forever, right? So what's the problem with just saying, well, it just happened? I suppose one response to this is, well, in general, we take it that existence claims bear the burden of proof. We see this embodied in epistemological and metaphysical principles like the principle of sufficient reason. Essentially, this principle says that for every fact F, there must be a sufficient reason why F is the case. Things don't just happen for no reason. A ball couldn't just pop into existence right next to your head. And if it did, if something did just pop into existence right next to you, well, you'd search for a reason for it. You would want to know why it had happened. So in the same way, the existence of something rather than nothing requires an explanation. Now, I mean, the principle of sufficient reason is, of course, very controversial. Let's grant it for the sake of argument. Even so, there are a couple of problems with applying this principle in this context. One concern is that it's not legitimate to apply an epistemological principle which we have derived from the behaviour of things in our universe to the creation of the universe as a whole in the first place. So that is, it may be the case that the behaviour of things within our universe is governed by laws or principles that do not hold extra universally. Maybe the conditions which make the principle of sufficient reason a reasonable epistemological or metaphysical principle, maybe those conditions came into existence with the universe. So again, it may be illegitimate to take that step from applying it to things in the universe to the universe as a whole. A deeper problem, however, is if we're using an unrestricted form of the principle, at least, it doesn't actually distinguish between something and nothing. Again, the idea is that for any fact F, there must be a sufficient reason why F is the case. So suppose there were nothing. Well, in that case, there must be a sufficient reason why there is nothing rather than something. And it's not obvious that this is an easier question. So we might try saying, well, there's nothing rather than something because there's nothing to bring something into existence. But equally, if there's nothing to stop something coming into existence either. In any case, it doesn't look like we can use the principle of sufficient reason to show that something is less probable than nothing. So, at the very least, the principle of sufficient reason doesn't give us an answer to the question, why shouldn't there have been something? Rescher says that the brute fact view kind of verges on mystificationism, and it has the same problem as mystificationism in that it's a solution of last resort. In general, we don't accept brute facts unless other avenues have been exhausted. So there's another methodological principle here that we proceed as if there is an explanation and we try to find it. But it would be possible to defend the brute fact view in principle. So what we would need is a good background theory which entails that an explanation will not be forthcoming. Rescher gives the example of how, given quantum theory, there is simply no explanation for why a particular atom decayed exactly when it did. I can ask, why did the uranium atom decay at 10 p.m. rather than 10:15 p.m? There is no answer. No explanation is possible. The atom just decayed when it did, and that's that. At least if we accept contemporary quantum theory, there's just not going to be an answer to that. It is simply a brute fact that the atom decayed when it did. The problem, of course, in the case of our question is, the question of why there is something rather than nothing. We don't have a well-confirmed background theory that entails that the existence of something is a brute fact. Okay then. Fourth, there is what I'm calling the indifference approach. This view is not noted in Rescher's article, but I think it's worth examining because I think it's actually quite a popular option. The basic idea behind this approach is that there's nothing surprising about the fact that there is something. So consider the whole set of possible worlds, the whole set of ways the world could have been. Well, there are infinitely many ways for there to be something, but there's only one way for there to be nothing. There are an infinite number of possible worlds, and all of them, bar one, contain something. There's only one empty world. Now, if we assign an equal probability to each alternative possibility, then it's almost certain that there is something. I call this the indifference approach because the idea is there's no reason to expect any one of these worlds rather than any other to be actualized. It's like reality is indifferent, right, between all of the possible worlds. So since there are an infinite number of something worlds and only one nothing world, well, it's no surprise that there's something rather than nothing. This is the explanation. There are just so many ways for there to be something and only one way for there to be nothing. So there you have it. Of course, the assumption of this response is that all outcomes are equally probable, that all of the possible worlds are equally likely to be actualized. But is this, or at least all of them have an equal probability of being actualized, but is this right? Well, many philosophers have thought that actually nothingness is more probable, or nothingness is the default outcome in some sense. Indeed, consider how we framed our title question. We've asked, why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, in a way, in asking this question, we're assuming that something is in special need of explanation. Anyway, so is there in fact a problem about, is there in fact something problematic about treating all possibilities as on a par, about treating each possible world as just as probable as any other? Well, one argument for the view that nothingness is more probable is that nothingness is simpler than something. In general, there's a general view that simpler states are more probable. Increases in complexity demand a further explanation. This is the idea behind Occam's razor. We favour those theories that do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Since the empty world is the simplest of all possible worlds, that is the world that prima facie we should expect to obtain. So the indifference approach fails. Reality isn't indifferent, right? It's simpler states are kind of favoured. Simpler states are more probable. So the fact that something that is that is not so simple obtains requires special explanation. Does this work? Well, we can grant that the empty world is the simplest world in various senses of the term simple, but does that entail it's more probable? Peter van Inwagen, in his article Why Is There Anything at All?, draws an interesting analogy. In China in the 1960s, there were political rallies during which thousands of people would produce a portrait of Chairman Mao by holding up sheets of cardboard coloured either red or white. And by getting just the right combination among these thousands of people, you can generate a portrait of Chairman Mao in red against a white background. Now, Van Inwagen says, imagine that a group of saboteurs had randomised the seat assignments or the assignment of the boards. In that case, when the signal is given for the people to hold up their boards, what would we see? Well, obviously we'd see an expanse of pink, basically. We'd see white noise like the static on old television screens, except with red and white pixels, as it were. Now, we can imagine somebody arguing, well, pure white and pure red are the simplest states of the system, so it's more probable that we will see pure white or pure red than any other given outcome. It's more probable that we will see pure white than we will see a portrait of Mao. Well, that's just nonsense, right? Pure white may well be the simplest state, but it's not more probable than any other distribution of red and white. If the system has been randomised, then all distributions are of equal probability. So the fact that the empty world is the simplest in some sense, that doesn't in itself entail that it's more probable than any other given world. It's maybe not clear how we can judge the probability of these different worlds. In any case, there's a general difficulty for any response to the indifference view, which proceeds by trying to show that nothingness is more probable, that the empty world is more probable than any other world. The whole point of the indifference approach is that there is one empty world, but an infinity of worlds at which there is something. Now, we've assumed in stating this approach that there is nothing that favours the empty world, that there is nothing that makes the empty world prima facie more probable than any other given world. But even if there were some reason why the empty world would be favoured, even if the dice were stacked in favour of the empty world, well, that's still a dice with an infinite number of other options. An argument that the empty world is more probable than any other given world is not an argument that the empty world is probable, period. Right? If I buy 100 lottery tickets, it's more probable that I will win than that each individual who bought one lottery ticket will win. But it doesn't thereby become probable that I will win. And it's not clear what an argument for the claim that the empty world is probable, period, would even look like. So perhaps this is not a promising line for the objector to the indifference approach to take. A more serious response to the indifference approach is that it rests on the assumption that there is at most one world at which there is nothing. There is only one empty world. We might wonder whether this is true. Why shouldn't there be more than one empty world? Well, to answer this, we need to consider how possible worlds are individuated. A general assumption is that in order for two possible worlds to be distinct, there must be some proposition that is true of one that is not true of the other. Basically, this is just to say, if we are claiming that X and Y are two distinct possible states, then there must be some difference between X and Y. There must be something that is true of X, but that is not true of Y. The way to think about this intuitively is, suppose I'm going to flip a coin, and I ask, what are the possible states that it can be in once it lands? Well, one possibility is that it lands heads. The other is that it lands tails. I suppose there's also an outside possibility that it lands on its edge. But now suppose somebody were to object, hey, you haven't stated all the possibilities, because there's also another possibility that it lands heads. Right? Yeah, there's the possibility you said, right, that it lands heads, but there's another possibility that it lands heads. I mean, it's difficult to know how to even make sense of that objection, right? Like, I've already listed the heads. There isn't some further other heads possibility. So, in general, you only have two distinct possible states if different propositions are true of them. There is no distinction between possible worlds without a difference between them. Okay then, For somebody proposing that there is more than one empty world, the question is going to be, well, in what respects do these worlds differ? Obviously, they don't differ in terms of what objects they contain, in terms of what concrete things they contain, because they are empty. But perhaps empty worlds might differ with respect to the laws that govern them. Maybe there's one empty world in which the laws of general relativity hold, another where the laws of Newtonian mechanics hold, another where the laws of Aristotelian physics hold. In one empty world, the gravitational constant might be 5% greater than it is here. In another empty world, 5% lower, and so on. In these cases, the worlds are governed by different laws. It's just nothing obeys those laws because nothing actually occupies those worlds. If this kind of scenario is possible, if it's possible for there to be empty worlds that differ in the laws that obtain in them, then there will be an infinity of empty worlds, and that will undermine the indifference approach. The big question here is, if the world is empty, if it contains nothing concrete, in virtue of what could the laws hold? We must be conceiving of laws as grounded in something abstract. We must be thinking of the laws as being some sort of abstract principles that stand behind the concrete entities and that constrain or that govern them in some literal sense. An alternative view is that laws simply describe regularities in the behaviour of things in the world. So on this alternative view, an empty world would be a world without laws, and there would be only one empty world. You might want to check out my series on, I say series, I've got two videos. I've got two videos on laws of nature for more on this, more on these two different ways of conceiving of laws. Suffice it to say that any position we take on the nature of laws is going to be controversial. Okay then, time to turn to the final view that we will look at in this video, the Necessitarian approach. There are many different forms of Necessitarianism, but the basic idea that unites them is that something exists as a matter of logical necessity. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because it could not have been otherwise. There must have been something, right? So one form of the Necessitarian approach is the theological approach. On this view, the world exists due to the action of God. God brought the world into existence. Then, of course, the question is going to be, why does God exist? Well, God himself is uncaused and exists necessarily. God is a necessary being, and as such, could not have failed to exist. Of course, this kind of view is only going to be convincing to those who accept the existence of God and who conceive of God as having the property of necessary existence. I won't examine that position in detail here. I mention it just to give a flavour of the variety of necessitarian views. So let's turn to a more, I guess, naturalistic, or at least non-theological way of thinking about necessitarianism. So we've already brought up this idea of possible worlds. Philosophers talk about possible worlds as a tool for analysing modal claims about possibility and necessity. Now, framed in terms of possible worlds, to say that X is possible is to say that there is a world at which X is the case. To say that X is necessary is to say that in every world X is the case. Now, there's a fairly straightforward argument for necessitarianism. If we adopt this view of modality, it looks like nothingness is just impossible. To say that nothingness is possible would be to say that there is a world at which there is nothing. But what does this mean? It looks like there's perhaps an incoherency here. After all, if W is a world, then W is something. So throughout this video, I have been talking rather carelessly, you might think, of the empty world, right? The world at which there is nothing. But what the hell could that be, right? I mean, what are we even conceiving of there? How could there be a world at which there is nothing? What sense does that make? This point can be made more forcefully depending on how we define what exactly a world in general is. So a standard definition is that a possible world, is a maximal connected object. to quote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this, an object is connected if any two of its parts bear some kind of spatio-temporal relation to one another. An object is maximal if none of its parts is spatio-temporally related to anything that is not also one of its parts. A world is connected then if every part is spatio-temporally related, however indirectly, to every other part. A world is maximal when no part is spatio-temporally related to the part of any other world. So worlds on this view are defined as spatio-temporally isolated wholes. Whole as in like the whole thing, right? Not whole as in like a donut hole, but a whole thing, right? What makes two things part of different possible worlds is that they have no spatio-temporal relations to each other. Now, on this view, a world must contain something, right? Every world contains something because every world has some space-time structure. So there is no empty world, right? I mean, I guess there might be worlds that have a space-time structure, but there's like kind of no objects in them. But there's still going to be the space-time, so there's not going to be nothing. Now, I think there are some fairly obvious difficulties with this form of necessitarianism. For one thing, we might worry that this way of ruling out the possibility of nothingness is really just a limitation of our descriptive apparatus. We ask this question, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? And this approach answers it by saying, well, nothingness is impossible. And why is nothingness impossible? Well, because we have defined X is possible to mean there is a world at which X is the case. And of course there cannot be a world at which there is nothing because there cannot be an empty world. If you've got a world, you've got something. I mean, something feels a little bit sneaky here, right? Maybe what we should say to this is simply, well, okay, the framework of possible worlds does not capture all of the modal facts, right? It's a fact that nothingness is possible. If that can't be stated in terms of this framework of possible worlds, well, so much the worse for the possible worlds framework. And this need not be a dogmatic response, because there are arguments for the possibility of nothingness. A famous one is the subtraction argument. For any particular concrete object, it's possible that this object does not exist. And for any particular bit of space-time, it's possible that it does not exist. There is a possible world identical to ours, except it contains 5 fewer particles. And then there is a world identical to that world, except it contains 5 fewer particles again. Now, you can continue subtracting things like this, removing one thing at a time without adding anything. After all, removing one particle does not necessitate the existence of anything else, right? You can just take something away. Eventually you're down to a world that contains 3 particles, then 2, then 1. Now take our world with 1 particle. Well, we know it's possible that this particular particle might not have existed. We'll call it particle A, right? World W1 contains particle A. Again, imagine the world with 2 particles, right? We got world W2, that contains particles A and B. Well, when we imagined this world, we might have removed particle A instead, which would have left only particle B. So we know it's possible that particle A not exist, because we could have removed it when we were thinking of world W2, which has 2 particles. We could have removed particle A. We know it's possible that particle A doesn't exist, but particle A is the only particle in world W1, the world we are considering. So we can remove particle A, and there, you've got it. You have your empty world. So there's the subtraction argument, which would seem to show that nothingness is possible. Again, if we can't state that in terms of the framework of possible worlds, well, so much the worse for that framework. Here's another argument for the possibility of nothingness. Suppose it's true that there is no empty world, right? There is no world at which there is nothing. That was the thing that the necessitarian that was the crux of the argument for the necessitarian, right? Is that possibility is defined in terms of possible worlds, but the idea of a world at which there is nothing is incoherent. Let's grant that. Okay, grant that there cannot be a world at which there is nothing. Even so, it still seems a sensible question to ask, well, okay, why is any world actualized? Right, there's the actual world, this world, okay, and then there are many merely possible worlds. Now, unless you are an outright modal realist, right, you will take it that these merely possible worlds do not exist as concrete entities, right? Possible worlds are abstract. Maybe they're abstract mathematical structures or abstract linguistic structures or whatever. In general, possible states of affairs don't exist, at least not in the same kind of way that actual states of affairs exist. They're merely possible. So there is the actual world, right? There are the actual states of affairs that obtain, and then there's a host of merely possible worlds. Now the question is, why couldn't all worlds have been merely possible? I mean, the vast majority of them are merely possible, right? So why is any possible state actualized? So we can still frame this question of, why is there something rather than nothing? We don't have to suppose that there is literally an empty world, right? A world at which there is nothing. I mean, this does seem to really be a better way to state the issue, because this allows us to state the question without, reifying nothingness. We don't need to treat nothingness as a state that might have obtained. We can grant that it's impossible for there to be a genuinely empty world, a world at which there is nothing, because the very idea of a world at which there is nothing is incoherent. We can grant that to the Necessitarian, but it seems like it might have been the case that no possible world was actualized, in which case there would have been nothing. So the claim that the empty world is incoherent, even if we grant that, it's not clear that we get the Necessitarian conclusion. Okay then, so that's one way we might try to develop the Necessitarian approach. Right, is to argue that the empty world is incoherent, since there cannot be an empty world, and since nothing is possible only if there is a world at which there is nothing, well, nothing is impossible. There is another Necessitarian view, defended by Robert Nozick in his Philosophical Explanations, and this is the fecundity view. So this is quite a different way of developing a Necessitarian approach, of holding that something must have been the case. There could not fail to have been something. Okay, recall that one of the features of the indifference approach was that it attempts to treat all possibilities as being on a par. So the probability of any given world being realized is equal to that of any other world. But there is another way to treat all possibilities as on a par. We might instead say that all possibilities are realized. There is ultimately no ontological difference between the various different possibilities. Every possible state of affairs does in fact obtain. Every possible world does in fact obtain. Every possible world is realized. Every possible world exists in just the same way this world does. So when we consider some fundamental laws and initial conditions C, and we ask, why C rather than D? Well, the answer is both C and D are realized. We happen to be in a C universe, but there is also a D universe. So there is no fact of C rather than D to be explained, because every possible world is realized. And this is, of course, this is just modal realism, the view defended by David Lewis for reasons completely independent of the question of why is there something rather than nothing. I have a few videos on modal realism that you may want to check out if you want more on this. Nozick calls this fecundity, fecund because all possibilities are realized independently. So anyway, Nozick notices that on all the other approaches to our question, right, there's this assumption that the natural state, as it were, for a possible world is non-realization. So when a possible world is realized, that must be explained by special factors, if only just random ones, right? I mean, that's the assumption of the indifference approach. On the indifference approach, there's an infinite number of possible worlds. One of them will be realized, right? One of them will exist concretely, and that happens at random. And then the objector says, well, yeah, it's not random. There's something that favours the realisation of some worlds over others. But, I mean, either way, we're taking it that the natural state for all possible worlds is non-realisation, and then some explanation must be given for the world that is realised. Nozick says we should reject this. If we assume that all possibilities are on a par, then since this possible world exists, right, the world that we currently occupy, well, this world clearly exists, this world is realised, all other possible worlds exist also. So, yeah, this is just straightforwardly modal realism. Okay then, the answer to our question, why is there something rather than nothing, is simple. There is nothing. Since all possibilities are realised, and the empty world is among the possibilities, the empty world is realised. If we ask the further question, why isn't there only nothing? Well, that would be to illegitimately assume that nothingness is a privileged state. It would be to illegitimately assume that there's something that, you know, privileges the empty world. But there isn't, right? The empty world is just one possibility among an infinite number, all of which are in fact realised, all of which obtain. Is this a satisfying answer? I mean, it certainly commits you to a fairly extreme ontology, but, you know, I mean, assuming we're willing to go in for the ontology of infinite possible worlds all existing, is it satisfying? Well, Nozick raises a concern here. We still have to explain why fecundity holds, don't we? I mean, so, like, according to fecundity, all possible worlds are realised. Fecundity itself seems to specify a natural state. Fecundity seems to assume that the natural state, as it were, for a possibility is to be realised. The natural state for a possible world is for the possible world to be realised. Well, contrast fecundity with near fecundity, in which all but one possible world obtains. Well, can't we now ask, why fecundity rather than near fecundity? That's not our original question. That's not the question of why is there something rather than nothing, but it's kind of similar, right? It's the question of why does everything that's possible obtain rather than just some of the possible things? But Nozick objects that this is illegitimate. There is, he says, no fact of fecundity rather than near fecundity, because both fecundity and near fecundity are realised. Every possibility specified by fecundity obtains, and every possibility specified by near fecundity obtains. Together, these are, of course, just the possibilities specified by fecundity. It makes no sense to ask, why fecundity rather than near fecundity? Because near fecundity is realised as part of fecundity. But we might press the objection. Isn't there another alternative? We might call it exclusive near fecundity. Exclusive near fecundity admits all but one of the possibilities and explicitly excludes the last remaining possibility. So exclusive near fecundity says something like, all of the possible worlds specified by fecundity are realised, except this one, which is not realised. Now, isn't there a fact to be explained here? Right? We can ask, why fecundity rather than exclusive near fecundity? So Nozick does give a response to this. I find his response a little bit obscure, but he says that the problem with this move is that exclusive near fecundity is not merely a description of possibilities. I guess one way to look at it is to say, well, you know, what does the exclusion of the possibility consist in? If exclusive near fecundity simply doesn't list some possible world as among the possible worlds that are realised, right? So if we can think of exclusive near fecundity as like listing possible states and then just leaving one out, well, in that case, exclusive near fecundity is equivalent to near fecundity, and Nozick's previous response holds. But, you know, what else? How else should it be interpreted? Is it saying that the possibility isn't possible? Well, that would be plainly contradictory. Again, I'm not entirely sure about this response. I actually wrote this script, I should say, 6 months ago, and I pretty much it was pretty much finished, and then I had a little note at this point that I should figure out exactly what Nozick's response to the exclusive near-fecundity point is. But the thing is that, as I say, I did this 6 months ago, and then I kind of just went and did other things. You know, my interests changed. Now it's been ages since I've actually looked at this, and I can't really be bothered to go back. So, you know, this is just the one bit that's kind of unfinished. I've never got it finished, so I'm just going to leave it there and move on. And if you're interested, you can pick up his book, Philosophical Explanations, and read in detail his response. Anyway, moving on. An important feature of fecundity is that it is capable of explanatory self-subsumption. So again, we saw earlier with respect to the first, it's a rejectionism, that there's a special type of explanation, explanatory self-subsumption. We can explain why fecundity obtains by subsuming it under itself. Fecundity states that all possibilities are realised, or as Nozick puts it, for any P, if P states that some realm of possible worlds obtains, then P is true. But here's the thing, fecundity itself states that some realm of possible worlds obtains, namely the realm of all possible worlds. Or more simply, fecundity states that all possibilities are realised, but fecundity is itself just one of these possibilities, because it's possible that all possibilities are realised. So fecundity explains itself. As Nozick puts it, and I quote, "If it is a very deep fact that all possibilities obtain, then that fact, being a possibility, obtains in virtue of the deep fact that all possibilities do." So fecundity is capable of explanatory self-subsumption. So Nozick suggests that fecundity has the virtue of offering a complete explanation. It answers our question, why is there something rather than nothing? It does not raise further questions of a similar sort, because the question, you know, why fecundity rather than near fecundity, that cannot be raised, nor, of course, can a question like why fecundity rather than far from fecundity, where far from fecundity says that only 10 possible worlds are realised. Because again, far from fecundity is just part of fecundity. So we've blocked the ability to raise those kind of analogous questions. And finally, fecundity subsumes itself. If we assume that fecundity holds, then it itself can explain why fecundity holds. Or at least we have, I guess, at least a sketch of an explanation in the form of this self-subsumption. So, well, there you have it. There were some answers to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And as I say, those are not all of the answers that have been proposed in the literature, but I hope that was, you know, an interesting place to start. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.